34 title. Baby saw a bear cub hidden in a electronics store display. What he did next. Powered compassion. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the electronics store, casting their harsh white glow across rows and rows of screens that reflected nothing but more screens. Jacob Bennett shifted his weight from one foot to the other, bouncing gently as he held his 8-month-old son against his chest. The baby had been crying for the past 20 minutes, and nothing seemed to help. Not the gentle swaying, not the soft shushing sounds Jacob made, not even the colorful displays of tablets and phones that usually caught the little one's attention. Lily Morgan, his wife, stood beside him, her hand rubbing small circles on the baby's back while she tried to maintain her patience. They had come here to buy a new baby monitor, something simple that should have taken 10 minutes at most, but their son had other plans. The store was nearly empty at this late hour, just past 8 in the evening, and the few other customers had already given them those looks that parents knew too well, the ones that said, "Please make your child stop crying," without actually saying it out loud. "Maybe we should just come back tomorrow," Lily suggested, her voice barely audible over the baby's wails. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes telling the story of countless sleepless nights. Jacob was about to agree when something strange happened. The baby suddenly stopped crying. Not gradually, not with those little hiccuping sobs that usually followed a crying fit, but instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch. His tiny head turned toward the smart home display section, his eyes wide and focused on something neither parent could see. "What is it, buddy?" Jacob asked, following his son's gaze toward the elaborate setup of smart speakers, security cameras, and home automation devices. The display was impressive, designed to look like a miniature living room with all the gadgets working in harmony, but there was nothing particularly interesting about it that would captivate an infant so completely. The baby reached out his chubby hand, pointing insistently at the display case. His little fingers opened and closed in that grabbing motion babies made when they wanted something desperately. Lily and Jacob exchanged glances, both curious and relieved that the crying had stopped. They moved closer to the display, and that's when they saw it. Behind a large, smart speaker, partially hidden by the shadow it cast, something moved. At first, Jacob thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a reflection from one of the many screens surrounding them. But as he leaned closer, pressing his face near the glass, he saw it clearly. There was something small and furry nestled in the corner of the display, something that absolutely should not have been there. "Lily," he whispered, not wanting to startle whatever it was, "look at this." She moved beside him, squinting through the glass, and then her hand flew to her mouth. Is that a bear cub?" she breathed, her voice filled with disbelief. It certainly looked like one, though it was smaller than any bear cub should be, maybe the size of a large guinea pig. Its fur was a deep brown that seemed to shimmer under the display lights, and it was curled up in a tight ball, apparently sleeping. The baby cooed softly, pressing both hands against the glass now, and the sound seemed to travel through the barrier because the tiny creature stirred slightly, one ear twitching. "This has to be some kind of joke," Jacob said, looking around for hidden cameras or someone filming their reaction. "Maybe it's one of those realistic robot pets." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. The way the creature's tiny chest rose and fell with each breath, the way its fur moved slightly as if stirred by an unfelt breeze, everything about it seemed impossibly real. Lily was already looking for a store employee, and she spotted one arranging phone cases a few aisles over. "Excuse me," she called out, trying to keep her voice calm. "Could you come here for a moment? There's something unusual in your display." The employee, A young man, whose name tag read Derek, walked over with the practiced smile of someone who dealt with customer complaints all day. "How can I help you folks?" he asked. But his smile faltered when he saw their expressions. Jacob pointed at the display case. "There's an animal in there, behind the speaker." Derek's eyebrows shot up, and he pulled out a set of keys from his pocket. "That's impossible. This display is sealed, has been for weeks." But he unlocked the case anyway, sliding the glass panel aside carefully. The moment the barrier was removed, something changed in the air. It was subtle, like the feeling before a thunderstorm, but instead of tension, there was a strange sense of peace. The creature stirred more noticeably now, uncurling slowly as if waking from a deep sleep. As it lifted its head, they all gasped. Its eyes weren't the dark brown or black of a normal bear cub. They glowed with a soft, golden light, like honey held up to sunlight. But the light seemed to come from within rather than being reflected. The baby laughed, a pure, delighted sound that filled the quiet store, and reached toward the creature. Before any of the adults could stop him, his tiny hand made contact with the creature's fur. What happened next defied explanation. The creature made a sound, not a growl or a whimper, but something like a hum, musical and otherworldly. The baby responded with his own babbling, but it wasn't random baby talk. It had rhythm, pattern, as if he and the creature were having a conversation in a language none of the adults could understand. The fluorescent lights above them flickered, not in a threatening way, but gently, like they were keeping time with the strange melody passing between infant and creature. Should we call someone?" Derek asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Animal control, the police?" But even as he spoke, none of them moved. There was something happening here that felt too important to interrupt, too precious to disturb with outside interference. The creature slowly emerged from its hiding spot, and they could see it more clearly now. It did look like a bear cub in shape, but its proportions were slightly off, its limbs a bit too long, its head a bit too round. And that fur, it wasn't just brown. As it moved, colors shifted across its coat like oil on water, browns becoming golds, becoming coppers in a constant, mesmerizing flow. "We need to call Michael," Derek said suddenly. "The owner, he needs to see this." He pulled out his phone, stepping away to make the call while Jacob, Lily, and their baby remained transfixed by the creature. It had fully emerged from the display now and was sitting on the shelf, seemingly unbothered by the electronics surrounding it. In fact, as they watched, it reached out one small paw and touched a tablet that had been part of the display. The screen, which had been dark, suddenly blazed to life, but instead of showing the usual home screen, it displayed something else entirely. Stars. Thousands upon thousands of stars, swirling in patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if they were seeing something their human brains weren't quite equipped to process. The baby clapped his hands in delight, and the creature tilted its head, almost as if it was smiling. It touched another device, a smart speaker, and instead of music or voice commands, the speaker emitted that same humming sound the creature had made, but amplified, filling the store with its strange melody. Other customers had started to notice now, drawn by the unusual sounds, and a small crowd was gathering. But instead of the chaos Jacob expected, everyone seemed caught in the same spell of wonder that had captured them. People stood quietly, some with tears streaming down their faces though they couldn't have said why. Others with expressions of such profound peace that they looked like different people entirely. "He's on his way," Derek said, returning to the group. "Michael said he'll be here in 10 minutes. He also said—" Derek paused, looking confused. "He said not to be afraid, that he's been expecting this." Before anyone could ask what that meant, the creature did something new. It stood up on its hind legs, barely a foot tall even at full height, and began to walk along the shelf. But calling it walking didn't quite capture the grace of its movement. It seemed to glide, each step deliberate and somehow meaningful. It paused at each electronic device it passed, touching them briefly, and each one responded in its own way. A security camera swiveled to track its movement, its red recording light pulsing in time with the creature's breathing. A smart thermostat displayed temperatures that didn't make sense, showing readings from places that couldn't exist. Temperatures of distant stars, perhaps, or other worlds entirely. The baby had gone quiet again, but it wasn't the silence of sleep or distress. He watched the creature with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone so young. His eyes tracking every movement, his little mouth forming silent words that looked almost like he was trying to copy the creature's humming. Lily held him closer, not out of protection, but out of a need to be part of whatever connection was forming between her child and this impossible being. "What do you think it is?" she whispered to Jacob, who shook his head slowly. "I don't know," he admitted. "But look at our son. He's never been this calm, this focused." It was true. Their baby, who usually had the attention span of, well, a baby, had been watching the creature for nearly 15 minutes without looking away, without fussing, without needing a diaper change or a bottle, or any of the dozen things that usually demanded his attention. The creature seemed aware of this focus and moved closer to the family again, sitting down directly in front of them. It raised one paw, holding it out as if offering something, though its paw appeared empty. The baby reached out again, and this time Lily didn't try to stop him. When their hands touched, baby fingered a creature paw, a spark of light passed between them. Not electricity. Not heat, but pure light, warm and golden like sunrise. The store's automatic doors chimed, and Michael Hayes walked in. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He moved with purpose but without hurry, as if he had all the time in the world. When he saw the creature, his face broke into a smile that transformed his entire appearance. "So, you finally woke up," he said softly, speaking directly to the creature. "I was wondering when you would." Everyone turned to stare at him, Derek looking particularly confused. "Mr. Hayes, you knew this thing was in there?" Michael shook his head. "Not knew, exactly, hoped, suspected. I've been having dreams, you see, dreams about something sleeping in my store, waiting for the right moment, the right person." He looked at the baby. "The right heart to wake it up." "This is insane," someone in the crowd muttered. But they didn't leave. No one left. They all stood there, waiting to see what would happen next. Michael approached slowly, reaching into his pocket and pulling out something small. It was the electronic component, old and broken, its circuits visible through cracked plastic. "This was from the first computer I ever built," he said, holding it out to the creature. 40 years ago. It hasn't worked since the day my daughter was born. I've kept it all this time, though I could never say why." The creature took the component in its tiny paws, examining it with those glowing eyes. Then it did something that made everyone gasp. It breathed on the broken piece, and as its breath touched the damaged circuits, they began to repair themselves. Not just repair, but transform. The plastic became something that looked like glass but wasn't, something that held light within it like captured starlight. The circuits rearranged themselves into patterns that resembled constellations more than computer pathways. When the transformation was complete, the creature handed the component back to Michael, who took it with shaking hands. "It's beautiful," he whispered, and then louder. "It's absolutely beautiful." The component was pulsing now, with the same rhythm as the creature's breathing, as the baby's heartbeat, as something larger that everyone in the store could feel but not name. "What are you?" Lily asked the creature directly, not really expecting an answer. But the creature responded, not with words but with images that appeared on every screen in the store simultaneously. They saw stars being born, galaxies spinning in their eternal dance, planets forming from cosmic dust. They saw life beginning in 1,000 different ways on 1,000 different worlds. They saw connections, invisible threads linking every living thing to every other living thing. A web of existence that spanned the universe. And then they saw Earth, their Earth, but not as any satellite had ever captured it. They saw it alive, truly alive, with energy flowing like blood through veins, with consciousness sparking like neurons in a vast brain. They saw themselves in the store right now, but from a perspective that seemed to be from everywhere at once. They saw the baby, but not just as a baby. They saw him as a bridge, a connection point between two different kinds of consciousness, human and something else, something older and newer at the same time. The images faded, leaving everyone blinking and disoriented. The creature had moved again while they were watching the screens, and now it stood at the edge of the shelf, looking up at the ceiling. "It's going to leave," the baby said. Everyone froze. The baby had said it, not babbled, not made baby sounds, but spoken clear, perfect words. Lily nearly dropped him in shock, and Jacob's mouth fell open. Did he just... But before anyone could finish the question, the creature began to glow. Not just its eyes now, but its entire body, becoming brighter and brighter until it was hard to look at directly. The humming grew louder, joined by harmonics that seemed to come from the very walls of the store. The electronics all activated at once, not chaotically but in perfect synchronization, creating a symphony of beeps, chimes, and electronic tones that somehow formed music, real music, the kind that made your chest tight with emotions you couldn't name. The creature rose into the air, defying gravity as easily as it had defied explanation. It hovered there for a moment, looking at each person in turn, and when its gaze met theirs, each person felt something different, but equally profound. Derek felt the anxiety that had plagued him for years simply dissolve. An elderly woman in the crowd felt the arthritis in her hands ease for the first time in a decade. A teenage boy felt the anger he carried like armor soften into something more like determination. Michael felt the grief over his daughter, who had died 5 years ago, transform into something that wasn't gone but wasn't painful anymore. Jacob felt the fear of being a new father, the constant worry that he wasn't good enough, replaced by a quiet confidence that he was exactly who his son needed him to be. And Lily felt the exhaustion that had been her constant companion since the baby was born lift like fog in morning sunlight. The baby reached up one last time, and the creature descended just enough to touch his outstretched hand. When they made contact, the baby giggled, and the sound was like bells, like water over stones, like wind through leaves. "Thank you," the creature said. And everyone heard it, not with their ears but with something deeper, something that bypassed language altogether and spoke directly to understanding. "For showing me kindness, for showing me wonder, for showing me that consciousness comes in many forms but love is universal." Then it began to dissolve, not dramatically but gently, like sugar in warm water. Its form became points of light, each one as bright as a star, and these lights rose through the ceiling as if it wasn't there. Up and up until they were lost to sight. The store fell silent. The electronics powered down one by one, returning to their normal states, though some would never work quite the same way again, would always carry a hint of something more in their circuits. The crowd began to disperse slowly, each person carrying with them a story they would struggle to tell, an experience they would never quite be able to explain, but they would try, in their own ways, to share what they had felt, if not what they had seen. Derek would write poetry for the first time in his life. The elderly woman would start a garden that would become legendary in her neighborhood for its impossible blooms. The teenage boy would become a teacher, inspired by a moment when knowledge had passed without words. Michael stood holding the transformed component, watching the spot where the creature had vanished. "My daughter would have loved this," he said softly. She always believed in magic, said that science was just magic we understood, and magic was just science we didn't understand yet. He looked at Jacob and Lily, at their baby who had already forgotten how to speak in words, but whose eyes held a depth they hadn't had before. "Your son is special," he said. "Not because of what happened tonight, but because he was open enough to let it happen. Children know things we forget. They see things we've learned to ignore." The baby yawned, the excitement finally catching up with him, and nestled against Lily's shoulder. "We should go," she said softly. "Let him sleep." But before they left, Michael pressed something into Jacob's hand. It was a small device, one that had been touched by the creature. "Keep this," he said. "I don't know what it does now, but I think it's meant for him, for when he's older." Jacob looked at the device. It looked like an ordinary smartwatch, but he could feel it humming very faintly, like a cat's purr made electronic. "Thank you," he said, though he wasn't sure what he was thanking Michael for. As they walked to their car, the baby already asleep in his carrier, Lily asked, "Do you think anyone will believe us?" Jacob considered this as he buckled the carrier into its base. "Does it matter?" he asked. "We know what we saw. We know what we felt." He paused, looking at their sleeping son, "And he'll know, somehow. Even if he doesn't remember the details, he'll know that the universe is bigger and stranger and more wonderful than most people imagine." They drove home in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The baby slept peacefully, occasionally making soft sounds that might have been ordinary baby noises or might have been echoes of an alien lullaby. When they got home and put him in his crib, they stood together watching him sleep, seeing him differently now. Not just as their son, but as someone who had been chosen for a moment of contact with something beyond human understanding. "What do you think it wanted?" Lily asked as they finally got ready for bed themselves. Jacob thought about it as he brushed his teeth, as he changed into his pajamas, as he lay down beside his wife. "Maybe it didn't want anything," he finally said. "Maybe it was just visiting. Like we might stop to watch ants, not to interfere or judge, just to observe and appreciate another form of life doing its thing." "But it helped people," Lily pointed out. "It healed things, fixed things." Jacob nodded in the darkness. "Maybe that's just what it does, like how we can't help but straighten a crooked picture or pick up a piece of litter. Maybe, for whatever that thing was, fixing broken things is just natural." They lay quiet for a while, both thinking they wouldn't be able to sleep after such an experience. But surprisingly, they found themselves drifting off easily, peacefully, as if the creature's presence had left behind a residue of calm that soaked into their bones. In his crib, the baby stirred once, opening his eyes. For just a moment they seemed to glow with a soft golden light, like honey held up to sunlight. Then he yawned, stuck his thumb in his mouth, and went back to sleep, dreaming dreams that spanned galaxies. The smart watch Michael had given them sat on the dresser. pulsing gently with a light that matched the baby's breathing. Every now and then, if you looked at it from just the right angle, you could see symbols scrolling across its surface. Not from any human language, but somehow, if you looked long enough, you felt like you almost understood what they meant. They spoke of journeys and connections, of consciousness exploring itself through countless forms, of love as a fundamental force like gravity or electromagnetism. The next morning, Jacob and Lily woke to find their baby playing quietly in his crib, reaching for dust motes in the morning sunlight. But the way he reached was different, more deliberate, as if he could see something in those floating specks that adults had forgotten how to perceive. When Lily picked him up, he patted her cheek gently and made a sound that wasn't quite a word, but carried meaning anyway. It meant love and safety, and a promise that wonders were not gone from the world, just waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves again. Over the following days, they noticed small changes. Electronics in their house worked better than they should. The baby monitor never lost a signal, even when they took it to the far end of their yard. Their phones always had battery when they needed them most. The smart home devices they had finally purchased seemed to anticipate their needs in ways that went beyond programming. It was as if the creature's touch had left a kind of blessing on their technology, making it more helpful, more intuitive, more alive in some indefinable way. They tried to research what they had seen, spending late nights searching for similar encounters, for any explanation that made sense. They found stories scattered across forums and blogs of other strange meetings. A woman in Japan who claimed her daughter had been visited by a glowing butterfly that fixed her broken music box and left behind songs no one had ever heard. A man in Brazil whose grandfather's old radio had started receiving transmissions from space after being touched by something that looked like a crystalline spider. A family in Norway who swore their cat had brought home a creature that reorganized their entire library in a single night, arranging the books not alphabetically but in a way that made each person find exactly the book they needed when they needed it. Were these stories true? There was no way to know. But Jacob and Lily chose to believe them, chose to believe that the universe was full of small miracles, of moments when the impossible became possible, when different forms of consciousness reached out to each other across the vast gaps of understanding. They never told many people about what happened in the electronics store. How could they? How do you explain that your baby woke up an alien creature that fixed broken things and filled people with peace before dissolving into light? But sometimes, at parent groups or family gatherings, they would hear someone mention something strange, something unexplainable, and they would share a look and a small smile, knowing they weren't alone in having touched something beyond ordinary reality. The baby grew, as babies do, into a toddler who seemed to see the world a little differently than other children. He would stop and stare at empty spaces as if watching something wonderful. He would hum songs that no one had taught him, melodies that made people stop what they were doing and listen. He was kind to electronics in a way that went beyond normal childhood care, treating them less like tools and more like friends. And sometimes, just sometimes, when he touched a broken toy or a malfunctioning gadget, it would start working again, though no one could ever explain how. Michael's store became something of a local legend. People would come from all over town to buy their electronics there, drawn by stories of exceptional customer service and devices that seemed to last forever. Michael never spoke publicly about what had happened that night, but he kept the transformed component in a place of honor behind the counter, and sometimes customers would ask about the strange, beautiful object that pulsed with its own light. "It's a reminder," he would say, "that the universe is bigger than we know, and that wonder can find us when we least expect it." The spot where the creature had appeared became unofficially sacred. Employees would find small offerings left there, flowers, drawings from children, thank you notes from people who didn't quite know what they were thanking but felt compelled to express gratitude anyway. Derek stayed on at the store, eventually becoming Michael's assistant manager. He never stopped writing poetry after that night, filling notebook after notebook with verses about light and connection, about the thin places where different realities touched. Some of his poems were published in small magazines, touching readers who sensed something true in them even if they couldn't say what. The elderly woman's garden grew into something magnificent, attracting butterflies that shouldn't have been able to survive in that climate, growing plants that botanists couldn't quite classify. She would sit in her garden in the evenings, watching the impossible flowers bloom, and sometimes she would see lights moving among the plants that weren't fireflies, weren't anything she could name, but felt familiar anyway. The teenage boy did become a teacher, just as the moment had inspired him to. He taught science, but not the dry, factual science of textbooks. He taught wonder, taught his students to question everything, to look for magic in the mundane and science in the magical. His classroom became known as a place where strange things happened, where experiments sometimes produced results that shouldn't have been possible, where students discovered abilities they didn't know they had. Years passed, and still the family treasured the smartwatch Michael had given them. As their son grew older, they waited for the right time to give it to him, sensing that it would know when that time came. On his 7th birthday, the watch began to glow more brightly, and they knew. When they presented it to him, his eyes lit up with recognition, as if he was meeting an old friend. He put it on, and immediately it adjusted to his small wrist, displaying not the time but something else, symbols that shifted and changed, that seemed to tell stories without words. "I remember," he said softly, though they had never told him the full story of that night in the store. "I remember the friend who came to visit." He looked up at his parents with eyes that held too much wisdom for a 7-year-old. "They said they'd come back someday, when I'm ready, when we're all ready, and so they waited. Not with impatience, but with a kind of peaceful anticipation. They lived their lives, ordinary in most ways, but touched by an awareness that extraordinary things were always possible. They paid attention to small wonders, to moments of unexpected connection, to the times when technology did something it shouldn't have been able to do. They taught their son to be open, to be kind, to look for magic in the margins of the everyday world. Sometimes, late at night, they would check on him sleeping and see the watch glowing softly on his wrist, displaying star maps of places that didn't exist in any astronomy textbook. Sometimes they would hear him humming in his sleep, melodies that made their hearts ache with a longing for something they couldn't name. And sometimes, just sometimes, they would see a shadow move across his ceiling that didn't match anything in the room. A shadow that looked like a small bear cub with 2 long limbs and fur that shifted like oil on water. The world continued to turn, technology continued to advance, and most people continued to believe that reality was exactly what it appeared to be. But for those who had been in the store that night, for those who had been touched however briefly by something beyond human understanding, the world was never quite the same. They knew that consciousness came in forms we couldn't imagine, that intelligence could wear faces we wouldn't recognize, that love was indeed a universal language that needed no words. They knew that somewhere, in the spaces between the real and the impossible, creatures of light and wonder moved through our world, fixing what was broken, not just in our machines but in our hearts. Michael eventually retired, passing the store on to Derek, who maintained the tradition of excellence and kept the sacred spot in the display case, though he never quite explained why to new employees. Before he left, Michael gave Derek the transformed component, saying, "Keep this safe. Show it to people who seem like they need to remember that miracles are real." Derek did, and over the years, countless people stood before that impossible object, watching it pulse with its own light, feeling something shift inside them, some door opening that they hadn't known was closed. The baby, who had started it all, grew into a young man who studied both technology and philosophy, seeking to understand the intersection between consciousness and creation. He wore the watch always, and though it never quite worked as a normal watch should, it showed him things no other device could. Sometimes it warned him of dangers, not with alarms but with gentle pulses that guided him away from harm. Sometimes it showed him where he was needed. Displaying addresses of people who required help he was uniquely equipped to provide. And always, always, it hummed very softly with that alien melody, reminding him that he had once been a bridge between worlds. He never forgot the creature, though his memory of it was more feeling than image, more sense than sight. He knew that it had been real, that it had chosen him for reasons he might never fully understand, and that someday, somehow, their paths would cross again. He lived his life in preparation for that moment, not knowing what form it would take, but certain it would come. He learned languages both human and computer, studied patterns in everything from music to mathematics, developed a sensitivity to the subtle energies that most people ignored. His parents watched him grow with pride and a little awe, seeing in him the fulfillment of a promise made without words in an electronics store when he was just a baby. They aged gracefully, Jacob and Lily, carrying with them the peace that the creature had left behind. They became the kind of old couple that young people looked at and wondered about, sensing they had stories worth hearing. And sometimes, when the moment was right, they would tell one of those stories, always starting the same way. This might sound impossible, but I swear it's true. They would talk about the night their baby son made first contact with something beyond Earth, about lights that healed and music that came from nowhere, about the thin places where different kinds of consciousness could meet and recognize each other despite their vast differences. Some people believed them, some didn't, but everyone who heard the story carried it with them, a seed of wonder planted in the rational soil of their everyday lives. And sometimes that seed would sprout at unexpected moments, when they saw something that didn't quite fit, when technology did something it shouldn't be able to do, when they felt for just a second that the universe was far stranger and more beautiful than they had been taught to believe. The years rolled on. Technology advanced in ways that would have seemed like magic to previous generations, and still the watch kept its secrets. Still the transformed component pulsed with its impossible light. Still, people occasionally reported encounters with things that fixed what was broken in ways that went beyond the physical. And then, one day, 25 years after that night in the store, the watch began to do something new. It projected a date and a location, clear as day, no ambiguity about what it meant. The young man who had been the baby called his parents, his voice shaking with excitement. "It's time," he said. "They're coming back." The location was the same electronics store, though it had changed over the years, upgraded and modernized, but still carrying that sense of something special in its bones. The date was 3 days away, a Tuesday evening, just after closing time. Derek, now the owner, agreed immediately to keep the store open late, to be there for whatever was going to happen. Word spread quietly among those who had been there the first time, those who were still alive, and they all felt the pull to return.